Hi, everyone, and welcome. Have you ever stopped to think about how a database, the thing running pretty much everything online, doesn't just completely fall apart when thousands of people are hitting it at the exact same time? Well, today, we're going to peek behind the curtain at the magic that prevents all that chaos. It's a core concept called database serializability. Let's get into it. So to really wrap our heads around this, let's think about a super common problem. The last ticket for that once-in-a-lifetime concert is up for grabs. You and some other diehard fan hit buy at the exact same millisecond. So who gets it? Does the system accidentally sell it twice? Does the whole thing just crash? You see, without some really clear rules, you get total chaos. And that right there is the core problem of concurrency. But don't worry, databases have a seriously clever way of handling it. Okay, let's make this even more real with a classic example, a simple bank account. Let's say you and your partner share an account, and right now it's got $500 in it. You both, from different phones, decide to deposit $100 at almost the same time. Easy, right? The final balance should obviously be $700. But let's see what can happen if the database isn't careful. So check this out. Let's watch how a database might mix up the steps from these two transactions. We'll call them T1 and T2. First, T1 reads the balance, $500. But before it can finish and save the new total, the system pauses it and jumps over to T2. Now, T2 also reads the balance. And what does it see? It still sees $500 because T1 never got to save its update. Okay, now back to T1. It does its math, 500 plus 100, and writes $600 back to the account. Then, a split second later, T2 does its math based on that old, outdated $500 it read, and it also writes $600 to the account. You see where this is going? And boom, disaster. The final balance is $600. You both put in $100, but the balance only went up by 100. An entire $100 just vanished. It's gone. This is a classic problem called a lost update, and it's a nightmare for keeping data accurate. So the bottom line is this. When you just let different operations run wild and mix together without any rules, your database can end up in a totally inconsistent state. The data just can't be trusted. And in the real world, that means lost money, messed up inventory, you name it. Okay, so how do we actually fix this mess? Well, the most obvious, straightforward solution is just to make everybody wait their turn. We could just force transaction T2 to wait in line until T1 is completely 100% finished. This is what we call a serial schedule, just running things one after another, nice and orderly. Now, this approach has one massive pro. It is absolutely guaranteed to be correct. That whole lost update problem with our bank account, it could never happen. But, and this is a huge but, the performance is just terrible. The whole reason we have these powerful modern databases is so they can multitask. Forcing everything into a single file line creates a massive bottleneck and basically throws all that power right out the window. And this leads us to the absolute genius idea at the heart of all of this. What if we could get the amazing performance of running things all at once, but with the rock-solid guarantee of correctness that we get from running them one at a time? Well, that is the goal of serialization. So here's the official definition. We call a mixed-up interleaved schedule serializable if the final result, the final state of the database, is exactly the same as it would be if the transactions had just run one after another. It doesn't matter which order, just as long as the outcome matches some possible serial order. So the database can jumble up the steps however it wants, as long as the final balance is $700, just like it would be if we ran T1 then T2 or T2 then T1. This quote just nails it. We don't have to force things to run one at a time. We just have to make sure the end result looks like they did. This is how we get the best of both worlds. We get the speed of doing things in parallel with the correctness of doing them in series. All right, so the big question is, how does a database actually know if a schedule is good or bad? I mean, it can't just test every possible outcome, right? That'd be way too slow. Instead, systems use a much, much smarter approach. They test for it by looking for conflicts between operations. And this brings us to the most common way this is all done in the real world, something called conflict-serializability. So what exactly is a conflict? Well, it's a very specific kind of clash. For two operations to conflict, three things have to be true. 1, they have to be from different transactions. 2, they have to be touching the exact same piece of data, like our bank balance. And 3, at least one of those operations has to be a write. So we're on the lookout for a read-write conflict, a write-read, or a write-write. Notice that two transactions just reading the same thing at the same time? Not a conflict. Nothing's changing, so no harm, no foul. Okay, let's go back to our crime scene, our bad bank schedule, and look for these conflicts. Here, T2 reads the balance before T1 gets a chance to write its update. That's a read-write conflict. But wait, it goes the other way too. T1 also reads the balance before T2 gets to write its update. That's another conflict. They are totally tangled up, fighting over the same piece of data. Now, to really see what's going on, we can draw a picture of these conflicts. It's called a precedence graph, and it's a super simple 3-step recipe. Step 1, make a little circle or a node for each transaction. So one for T1, one for T2. Step 2, find all those conflicts we just talked about. And finally, step 3, you draw an arrow if T1 does something that conflicts with T2, and T1's operation came first, you draw an arrow from T1 to T2. So what happens when we graph our bad schedule? Well, T2 reads before T1 writes, so we have to draw an arrow from T2 to T1. But T1 also reads before T2 writes, so we have to draw an arrow from T1 back to T2. And there it is. We've created a cycle. This is the smoking gun. A cycle in this graph tells us that this schedule is a logical impossibility. You can't untangle it into any valid one after the other order. And this brings us to the absolute golden rule of conflict serializability. If you can draw the precedence graph for any schedule, and that graph has 0 cycles, then that schedule is certified conflict serializable. It's clean, it's efficient, and it's a rock-solid way for a database to guarantee that your data stays correct. Now, conflict serializability is the one you'll see in the wild. It's the practical workhorse. But there is actually a broader, more theoretical definition that's good to know about. It's called view-serializability, and it looks at the problem from a slightly different angle. See, view-serializability doesn't really care about the specific order of conflicting reads and writes. It just cares that every transaction gets the same view of the data that it would have gotten in some serial schedule. For this to be true, 3 conditions have to be met. First, any transaction that reads the initial value of the data, our starting $500, has to do back in both schedules. Second, if one transaction reads data that was written by another, that same chain of who reads from whom has to be preserved. And third, whichever transaction gets the final word, the one that makes the last write, has to be the same in both schedules. So what's the point? Well, view serializability is technically more flexible. It can actually identify a few weird, very specific schedules as being correct, even though conflict serializability would have rejected them. But here's the catch. Actually checking for view serializability is incredibly difficult and slow. It's so computationally expensive that it's just not practical for most real-world systems to use. Okay, let's zoom out and put all these pieces together so we can see how this all fits into the big picture of how databases actually work. You can think of these schedules kind of like Russian nesting dolls. The smallest, most restrictive doll on the inside is our set of conflict serializable schedules. Every single one of those also fits inside the definition of being view serializable. And every view serializable schedule, by definition, is a correct serializable schedule. So what does this mean? It means if we know a schedule is conflict serializable, we have an ironclad guarantee that it's correct. So when it comes to the real world, it's all about that trade-off between power and practicality. And because checking for cycles in a graph is so fast and efficient, and it handles pretty much every situation you'd ever run into, the vast majority of database systems you use every day focus on ensuring conflict serializability. It hits that perfect sweet spot between correctness and performance. But how do they do it? I mean, they're not literally drawing graphs for every single operation. That would be crazy slow. Instead, they use these really clever protocols that are guaranteed to only ever produce schedules that are conflict serializable. The most famous one is called two-phase locking, or 2PL. Basically, it makes a transaction grab all the locks on the data it needs before it's allowed to release any of them. That simple rule is enough to elegantly prevent those graph cycles from ever even forming. So the next time you book a ticket or check your bank balance, just take a second to remember these invisible rules working tirelessly behind the scenes, preventing chaos and keeping your data safe and sound. But it does leave us with a really interesting question to think about. As our databases get spread all across the globe and become massively distributed, are these classic definitions of correctness going to be enough? Or will we need to invent entirely new ways to define what it means for our data to be correct?